Panic attacks are characterized by extreme fear and terror, intense physical sensations, and action tendencies to escape. They can have a sense of impending doom and dread. They are often linked with catastrophic thoughts, although you don't always have thinking with panic. It can be very physiological and a feeling and no obvious thoughts. People vary greatly in, how much it's obvious auditory thoughts, catastrophic images, just physiological sensations. Um, but the thoughts that are often there are fears of dying or harm, fear of losing one's sanity, losing control, embarrassing yourself. Sometimes it has that more social function. There can be a sense of being trapped or a fear of sort of stuck in this panic state ongoingly. And we might have thoughts like, I'm going to die, or you're going to collapse or faint, or you're going to have a heart attack, you're going to go mad, you're going to be sick, you're going to embarrass yourself and look weak, you're going to have a bathroom accident, you're going to um, embarrass yourself in various ways. So sometimes there are these really obvious thoughts. Other times it's images. So we might have catastrophic images of what we're afraid is going to happen. And then other times it's just like the feeling, and you could probably put the thoughts into words. You could guess what the mind is thinking, but really it's a felt experience, very intense physical sensations. There's different physiology for people. Some people, they have the rapid and shallow breathing, and often there's this sort of movie Hollywood style panic attack where people are hyperventilating. But for a lot of people, it's actually more air hunger and suffocation and choking. You sort of feel like you can't catch your breath. Your heart's sort of pounding away. You're noticing you can hear your heart rate or feel your heart rate more. Obviously, it feels like it's intensifying. It might be feeling like you're missing beats, or there's sort of ectopic beats, it gets called, heart palpitations, so an irregular rhythm. You might have chest pain and discomfort, shaking. People often feel they're shaking, or you have muscular tension. You feel your jaw or your head is very tight, or your neck and shoulders, or your pelvis or other areas. You can be sweating and hot. You can be cold and sweating and funny temperature things. You can feel dizzy and this sort of tunnel vision and blurry vision, and things are happening within your perceptual system. You can feel faint. People worry about fainting sometimes. You can feel nauseous. You can feel different sensations in the pit of the stomach, like the stomach's in knots, or there's like a hollow, empty feeling, or a sinking feeling, unpleasant butterflies, sort of cramping. You sometimes feel you need the bathroom, and sometimes you actually do need to go. When you go, you might be running for number one or two. People have different things. Some people feel like they're going to be sick, and there can be emetophobia, where the fear of sickness being tangled up in it. Um, uh, Within the symptom profile, people will talk about depersonalization. So you can feel that you are unreal, or derealization, the world feels unreal, or you feel you're not in your body, you're sort of outside observing yourself, or you're looking at the world through panes of glass. You feel detached. Not everyone has it, all of these symptoms. Some people have more or less. You can feel kind of numbness and tingling and funny physical sensations. You can have a racing mind, so your mind feels very busy, and sometimes you can pick the thoughts out, or other times they're so fast it's almost like just this feeling of a racing mind. And other times you have a blank mind and you feel like you can't think and you can't talk so easily, or you have headaches, perceptual disturbance in different ways. in any of your senses really. Your hearing can be funny. You think you hear things, think you see things, um, and many other symptoms. So it can be very individual, and people can have all kinds of different stuff and different areas it shows up. But really, you could think of it as it shows up at the muscle level, so in the kind of muscular tension or shaking or weakness, or it can show up in the visceral organs, so in the breathing or in the stomach, the heart, or it can show up in the perceptual, in the head, in the way our thinking is going, or how we're perceiving the world, or how we feel within our own head. And really, it's all about the fight, flight tendency and freeze. You can have panic attacks where you feel more frozen, but often it's flight. You're trying to get away. Sometimes there's fight. Sometimes you're irritated and angry as well, or there's a sense that you could channel that energy into fighting if you needed to. But probably the main tendency is the flight, the kind of getting away. But as I said, you can freeze, and that can be part of the dissociation. You feel like literally frozen in very more severe panic in trauma and things like that. Sometimes people do freeze and kind of dissociate, and it's hard to get back into your body, although you always can get back into your body. Sometimes you need the help of a therapist and to train it, but you can always move your eyes, and you can gradually move your body and get yourself activated again. And most people don't have it to that extent. Um, there can be lots of triggers, highly individual. Sometimes actually there's no obvious trigger and they seem to come out of nowhere. And they've sometimes done research that there can be patterns of breathing, and you can show the markers of a panic attack long before it happens. Um, Other times there's very obvious triggers. There's environments that are difficult, like large groups of people, or for other people, it's the feeling of being trapped if you're traveling, in trains or planes or automobiles. You can sometimes get it when you feel judged, so it's more of a social sort of panic attack. Physiological depletion, common if you're hungover or you've not had enough sleep, things like that. A lot of the time they come out of the blue though as well. Often stressful life events might precede more panic disorder. We might be feeling very burnt out, and we might have had trauma, we might have had grief and bereavement and loss, or we might be experiencing invalidating environments or problematic relationships. Things like that can be the preceders, and basically our baseline stress is very high, and then it's going to peak into this misfiring of panic. Um, there are compulsions or safety behaviors. Now, compulsions and safety behaviors often get used to distinguish different things, and typically, historically, compulsions have been more specific, ritualistic, involuntary behaviors to neutralize an intrusive thought, an obsession, or intrusive sensation or impulse. While safety behaviors is often seen as a broader term, and it includes compulsions, but also other actions or avoidance strategies to reduce anxiety more broadly. I personally see them as they're very overlapping, really, and I think it's problematic to say compulsions are always ritualistic, because we know in OCD a lot of people aren't doing specific ritualized things. They're doing more mental compulsions that are more like a conversation in the head rather than a ritualistic sort of practice. But let's just use those terms interchangeably, really. Safety behaviors has a nice connotation that we are doing these active behaviors to try and prevent danger. So it has a nice sort of sound to it, I think, in terms of panic. But really, I see a lot of overlap between these terms. People are often avoiding triggering situations, so they're not going to crowded public places, enclosed spaces, elevators, tunnels, bridges, planes, anywhere you feel trapped. Um, Driving is a big one for many people, certain driving conditions. For a lot of people, it's how far we're going away from home. We might have certain safe zones, and then further and further away we can't go. And this can get smaller and smaller until people end up being very much trapped in their house. Being alone can be something people avoid. Often people are doing these safety behaviors in the environment, so they're thinking about where they sit so that they can exit more easily. They might be, planning and imagining those safety routes. They're often carrying objects, substances that might soothe them in some way. So this can be medication, and people have the benzodiazepines in the wallet, or it could be, more like money and phones and things we believe we can use to access help or escape something. For many years, I would have things like sweets, the hope that if I ate a sweet as a child, it would sort of distract me, or I'd have a water with me the whole time, or certain things that we feel like they're going to be distracting. I actually had Vicks Vapor Rub, or Calval, I think it was called. It's like a decongestion. I would put it on a hanky even when I didn't have a cold, to have a sensory thing to try and sort of distract myself. So people will have their favorite sort of strategies for that. Phones massively nowadays, and trying to use phones to sort of do that. People self-medicate. You might visit A&E, or doctors' medical checks. I've done plenty of that myself in the past. Avoiding activities that stimulate your physiology, that get you out of breath or get your heart pounding. Avoiding caffeine. A lot of people do that. I mean, I had one period in my life with panic where I went from actually having a lot of caffeine to all of a sudden I couldn't even tolerate one, half cup of tea or coffee, and I just had stopped it all, or felt I had to stop it all. Part of my recovery was reclaiming caffeine, and I'm a big coffee drinker now, especially as a parent with young kids and having ongoing sleep disturbance. I couldn't survive without caffeine, but there were periods of time where, there was no chance I was going to drink it. We might be using technology nowadays to monitor our heart, and use our watch and look at our markers and blood pressure and things like that. We might be researching online, studying all about this sort of stuff, compulsive distraction, having safe people with us. People with panic often feel more comfortable with their safe person there, that they feel could get them out of a difficult situation or help them out. Um, we might want to know where that safe person is, at least, even if they're not with us. And then there's really the mental compulsions. This is the big part where we're doing a lot of mental activity in the run up to things that we think are panic induced. In fact, panic disorder is distinguished by we are doing a lot of worry about panic attacks in advance. So we're preoccupied and worrying. So you can think of worrying as a type of mental compulsion. Planning, so we're planning how to avoid it, how to escape. We're monitoring and checking for the external triggers and difficulties, and we're looking for exits and looking for ways to get out. We might be threat monitoring and ruminating about our internal symptoms, so we're monitoring our breathing or our heart rate, or our degree of dizziness or other anxious symptoms. So we're worrying, we're ruminating, we're analyzing, we're self-reassuring. We might be trying to convince ourselves we're okay, and we might be going over the past and reviewing memories. So a lot of the mental compulsions you see in OCD, and you see in generalized anxiety disorder and things like that. So that mental activity is giving us feedback to our system that this is a problem, this is something I can't handle. Actually, resentment, we might be resenting it and judging it, and comparing with others, and all of this mental activity is signaling this is a danger, a problem, and then it's increasing the anxiety that then layers up to create the panic attack. And it all reinforces the difficulty in the issue. And especially if we start doing the combination of physical avoidance, we're telling our brain, I can't handle this. We're then thinking about it all the time. It is teaching our brain that this is a problem. And really, panic attacks are common in the literature. Some studies will even say 33 people in 100 will have a panic attack each year. So it's a high number. But panic disorder is a lesser number. This is when you could have regular panic attacks and not develop panic disorder. You have to really be worrying a lot and preoccupied for large amounts of time and changing your behavior to try and control and avoid this in order to start to get into the panic disorder um, area, and agoraphobia being very related to that. So you're having recurrent and unexpected panic attacks. You're then having anxiety about the anxiety, and the bodily sensations become the trigger. We're worrying about future attacks, the consequences, and then we're making behavioral changes to try to control it. And we've really got this fear of experiencing fear. And agoraphobic avoidance is when people avoid the places and the triggers. So they're not really afraid of the triggers, they're afraid of the panic attack. So not the fear of the places, fear of the panic attack. And at its worst, I've worked with many people that get, trapped in their house. And I've had periods of time where I find it very, very hard to leave my house. And um, the territory of panic really gets larger, and the territory of our life gets smaller. It takes over more and more. And it can hit ceilings. It can hit ceilings where it's like, I know I have to get to my job, so I'm going to force myself to do it, but I'm not going to travel any other time outside of that. Really, really, it is something that is very misunderstood and judged, and we might be surrounded by people who don't get it and are really judging us because they think about their normal levels of anxiety and they compare it to these severe levels of panic. So it gets kind of framed as this predictable graph that's like 10 minutes to it peaking, and then I can't remember, is it 20 minutes or something like that? It's starting to come down. But I think really those of us who've experienced more intense periods of panic, that I don't remember it ever following this predictable graph. And many times I would get stuck in, you'd have this panic attack and it might ease, maybe it is following some degree of that physiology, but then the thoughts and the continual sense of dread and doom then re-triggers it. And you can feel like you're in these rolling panic attacks for sort of whole days. And that gets called hyperarousal sometimes when we're in this very high anxiety, if not panic. And it's probably true. It is coming down, but people often feel that we're stuck in that the whole time. And I had many months of feeling like that for large proportions of the day, and then it might switch to more feeling depersonalized and feeling unreal and detached, and then feeling depressed. So sometimes you get these cycles where you're having lots of panic and hyperarousal. And sometimes people talk about anxiety attacks to distinguish something that's not as intense as panic, but is pretty aversive. And so you might be in combinations of these. I often felt like I was cycling between, I'd have panic for a certain amount of time with depersonalization, and then it would tip to just depersonalization and depression, and it would sort of cycle back and forth. Um, I think something that's a little bit different to some of the sort of mainstream view of panic. I don't think everyone's panic attacks are the same. I think there's a range of intensity. I think there's a range of insight. So how much we believe the catastrophic thoughts. I think some of us are more emotionally sensitive in the sense that our nervous systems are a bit louder. Sometimes this can tie in with neurodivergence. You compare an autistic panic attack with meltdown and becoming non-verbal compared with someone having a panic attack and kind of knowing it's a panic attack, but still having a lot of the averseness and intense heart pounding and can't breathe and things, but they sort of know what it is. Well, those things aren't comparable. Trauma can intensify this, more adverse experiences we've had, more traumatic events. Sometimes you can have more intense panic attacks. I think the degree of our strength of self, how robust we feel can dictate it. When I was really struggling with panic, I felt very vulnerable. I felt, not as robust as I feel now. And I think sometimes you have therapists that have had panic attacks and, they have a stronger sense of self and they feel more self-efficacious and they were able to have these panic attacks and sort of know mostly what they were, and they compare that to someone who's in this higher level of intensity. So, one person worries about going to the bathroom, other people literally are having accidents, or, one person feels nauseous, another person is being sick, or, I've even worked with people who are having, seizures and things like that. It's like there are these different levels of intensity within panic, and I don't think it's so helpful to go, panic can't harm you. Panic is, your panic is the same as mine. It's like, okay, maybe it can't harm you, but it can be very aversive and intense and life disrupting. And that can happen for longer for some people and more intensely. And I think it's a more compassionate message to sort of say, not everyone's panic is the same, that it does vary. And the tools of recovery are the same no matter, it's just a more validating message than, I mean, I've heard certain therapists sort of talk about their panic attacks as if to say, well, I can cope with this, why can't you? When really it's like you're not having the same panic attack and it's not sticking around as long, and you believe you're self-efficacious, you believe you can do things to challenge it, you don't feel so vulnerable in who you are, you don't believe the story it's telling you as much, and the actual volume, the amount you can't breathe, the amount your heart's pounding, how nauseous you feel, how weak and shaky, they're not the same. Now, whether those things are intensified because of the struggle, I think they are in part. And I think some of that struggle is unconscious and you're not doing it on purpose. And in ACT, we talk about the struggle switch, and that's turned up higher. You then get more intense panic symptoms. But some of that is all, our biological vulnerabilities, as I said, trauma and neurodivergence, strength of self, and other things. So I think it's more validating to say that there's a range of intensity in these things, but we all can benefit from the same recovery methods. And I think dialectical behavior therapy talk about that. I've heard DBT talk about some people being emotional burns victims. So we just feel that emotion so much more rawly and intensely. And that was one of the places I've heard it talked about in quite a validating way. Um, yeah, it can link into this emetophobia, the fear of being sick, which can have different core fears and different reasons, and often trauma of, having had difficult experiences with sickness. And I think you can have the same with diarrhea and with wetting yourself and other things. I think sometimes people have had those experiences as a kid, panicking, and some of that is in your panic attack. There could be trauma memories. I've at times in the past had panic, and I've observed my mind and I've seen that there are memories of traumatic medical interventions and things I'd had in the past showing up. So sometimes your history is within the panic attack as well. Many people get it around driving. I certainly had a lot of panic and difficulty driving, and that can be a challenging thing. And we'll talk about that in the recovery methods. Um, I think a lot of people are also being very self-critical, so they have all the panic and vulnerability, and then they have another voice going, "You're weak. Why is this happening to you? You're embarrassing." And sometimes it's very self-critical, self-hatred even, and self-punishment, and that really stresses and intensifies it. If I'm being very critical about panic, it's like having a panic attack and someone's shouting at me at the same time. It's just going to make it even more intense. So self-compassion is very helpful, and we'll talk about that with the recovery methods. Um, I mean, I'm coming from lived experience. I think, a lot on this channel, I've shared my experience with OCD, but I also have a long history with panic and with depersonalization, together with panic. I won't share all of it because we'd need another few hours, but I started getting panic attacks when I was very young. I remember them, some of my earliest memories. Sometimes they would come out of nowhere and I'd feel like I was being crushed in my head. And then I would feel depersonalization and my heart would be pounding and I would be struggling to breathe and feeling, frozen and very shaky and weak and other things. And, really all the physiological symptoms and other things I experienced. But I would have a lot of panic that then went to depersonalization, but I would also have it the other way around. I would feel very unreal and then have a panic attack because of that, or I'd feel very real. I did another video on this recently. I'd feel sort of hyper real and then panic would set in around that. So I had interactions between my panic and depersonalization. When I was younger, I didn't have so much ongoing depersonalization. It was more transient and a symptom of panic. It was later that I had longer episodes, like many people with depersonalization, where it just lasts for months or longer. Um, and I experienced this a lot, and I would have it every school assembly, anytime I was in audiences, big groups of people, public speaking. I would do everything I could to avoid it. Um, Playing sports, I would have panic attacks. I remember I'd be playing table tennis or doing, any sport that I liked, and suddenly I would feel very depersonalized, and then I would feel panicky and just trying to play through that. It's very, very difficult. I think the earlier panic attacks, I had the real can't function, sort of shut down. And they thought I had epilepsy. I was sort of diagnosed and treated for epilepsy because of the panic I was having. And I think now I don't believe it was epilepsy because I think later in my life I've had all the same symptoms. And, when I went to the doctor and stuff at that time, no one was going, oh, I think you've got epilepsy. I think that was just the 80s, 90s, early 90s sort of time when I was going through this, where, that was one of the things they were viewing this in children. So I had a lot of it in childhood and very linked to my OCD and, linked to other difficulties at that time. I built up some natural tolerance. I sort of would get a lot of the same panic symptoms, but be able to sit in audiences and sort of, I had some of these symptoms as I went through university, but I was starting to develop some tolerance. I really hated them, but I could kind of sit there in a university or auditorium and not run out anymore and things like that. But then as I had real difficult times with OCD later, it's like the panic got worse again. And I had a few times when I went to hospital and I went to A&E thinking I was having a heart attack or I thought I was losing my mind or, I did, all the things we talked about here. I was hyper aware of my symptoms, a lot of breath hunger, really struggling with that, a lot of heart palpitations, a lot of depersonalization, a lot of dizziness, and just feeling like I'm not in my body, and all that stuff, and having during the difficult times with OCD, just having ongoing panic, feeling like I'd wake with a panic attack, and then I'd have it throughout the night as well, wake up many times panicking, and I'd struggle. And I had periods of time where I'd seem to have panic the same time every day. So it seemed to be afternoon at about 3 o'clock, if I remember rightly. I would had this period where I'd just suddenly be hit with absolute dread and impending doom, like I was going to die and any minute now. And I'd have a lot of that. And I had a lot of the core fears around panic, and I'm literally dying. Sometimes a very physical, heart attack, some sort of physical health difficulty, but then other times it was more like abstract than that. It was like just the sense that I was doomed, and I couldn't even tell you why, but it felt like I was about to die, and very intertwined with DPDR. And when I had my existential OCD, I had times where everything within the existential triggers would just trigger rolling panic attacks, all day long, or I had it a lot with health anxiety as well. And many, I could tell you many more experiences and, you know, all the stuff I've sort of talked about here, some very difficult times with panic. And maybe I'll share some more of them as I talk about recovery. I mean, driving and flying. I've really struggled to fly and gave up flying. And I had a period of my life I wasn't driving because of where I was living, but I wouldn't have gotten a car at that time. I struggled getting in cars with other people and, all kinds of stuff. So what we'll move on to in the next videos is starting to explore recovery methods, how to work with this, what we can do in response to panic.